Driving along a road in southern Brazil, Heinrich Frank spots an unusual hole in the midst of a modern development. It's unlike anything that the geologist has seen before. Convinced the tunnel isn't a natural phenomenon, he returns for a closer look and discovers something incredible hiding in plain sight. Massive tunnels in Brazil were actually dug by one formidable ancient creature. In fact, there are strange caverns like the one Frank discovered etched all over the landscape of Brazil. And for a long time, people believed that they'd been carved out of the rock by early human inhabitants. But the giant size of the tunnels and the terrifying claw marks scratched into their walls hinted another, far stranger explanation. So if neither humans nor natural forces created these tunnels, then what did? By climbing inside these enigmatic holes and documenting their findings, research teams across the country have tried to solve the mystery once and for all. And what they've found offers a fascinating insight into the prehistoric world. As it turns out, Frank was far from the first Brazilian to stumble upon a strange hole in the ground of this kind, with a scale and formation that defies any obvious explanation. Apparently, scientists have been observing similar tunnels since the 1930s, and perhaps even earlier. But it was only towards the beginning of the 21st century that they started to receive widespread attention. One of the most well-known examples, it seems, is that discovered by geologist Amilcar Adami during 2010. At the time he was traveling through Rondônia, one of Brazil's Amazonian states, conducting assessments for the Brazilian Geological Survey. But in the end, it was more than the sprawling rainforest that would capture his attention. While in Rondônia, reports state, Adami heard tales about a strange cave system somewhere in the region. Intrigued, he began pressing the locals for information, and eventually his perseverance was rewarded. Following the trail, he found himself at a remote spot close to the border between Bolivia and Brazil. There, Adami spotted what he'd been searching for: a mysterious tunnel in the dense forest. But his initial attempts to investigate the anomaly were cut short. You see, the geologist didn't have the landowner's permission to enter the area, and without it he could only observe the tunnel briefly. Even a cursory investigation, though, revealed that this was something strange. As a geologist, Adami understood the natural processes that had shaped the Brazilian landscape over millions of years. And he'd even been in caverns on the very same hillside, where he'd noted how water had hollowed out the rock and left tunnels behind. But this tunnel, Adami knew, wasn't the result of common erosion. With its huge circumference and odd level floor, the formation left the geologist baffled. Speaking to Discover magazine in 2017, he said, "I'd never seen anything like it before. It really grabbed my attention. It didn't look natural." Without the time or resources to look any deeper, Adami was forced to abandon the tunnel, though he planned to come back at a later date. Yet it'd be another 5 years before he was able to come back to Rondônia. And by then, his strange discovery had acquired some company in the annals of bizarre geology. In 2008, Frank, a geologist at Brazil's Federal University of Rio Grande do Sul, was heading home for the day when he stumbled upon a similar tunnel. Speaking to radio news program The World during 2021, he said, "I was on the highway, going 60 miles an hour, on a Friday afternoon, and I saw this excavation with a hole. So, I went there, and I saw it was a tunnel." Frank continued. Like Adami, he knew that there was nothing in the local geology that might explain such an unusual formation. And so, he resolved to return for a closer look. Fortunately, it was just weeks, rather than years, before Frank was able to visit again. Returning to the location in Novo Hamburgo, a town in southern Brazil, Frank found himself climbing into a tunnel that stretched 15 feet into the earth. But that wasn't the most impressive thing about the formation. At its very deepest point, the geologist spotted a series of giant claw marks crisscrossing the rock. Stumped as to what could have caused such a tunnel to form, Frank had to delve deeper for answers. And in time, he came across a term that seemed to describe what he was seeing. Apparently, some scientists refer to these formations as Peleabros, in other words, cavities created in the earth by prehistoric creatures. "I didn't know there was such a thing as Peleabros," Frank told Discover. "I'm a geologist, a professor, and I'd never heard of them. But what sort of creature could have created such a huge cavity in the landscape of southern Brazil?" The more he studied the formation, it seems, the stranger it became. Now thoroughly intrigued, Frank began hunting for Peleabros across the region and found them in plentiful supply. In fact, on one 45-mile stretch of new road near Porto Alegre, he found that almost 3/4 of the road cuts contained the formations. In some cases, they were unfilled, while others were overflowing with debris. One tunnel, according to Discover, measured 4 feet across and would probably once have extended 250 feet in length. And again, the rock face was covered in the same sinister patterns. Frank observed, "There's no geological process in the world that produces long tunnels with a circular or elliptical cross-section, which branch and rise and fall, with claw marks on the walls." As Frank was out locating Peleabros across the state of Rio Grande do Sul, Atomy was plotting another visit to Rondônia. And in 2015 he discovered that the strange tunnel he'd spotted in the hillside was also a Peleabro, and a significant example at that. The only one found in the Amazon to date, it's among the biggest on record as well. According to Discover magazine, the burrow's actually a complex of tunnels, with a combined span of some 2,000 feet. And the shafts themselves were a staggering 6 feet high, stretching to 5 feet across in some places. Altogether, experts estimate that around 4,000 tons of material would have been excavated in order to form the network. Elsewhere, in the neighboring state of Santa Catarina, the Morro Grande Peleabro is even bigger. In places, according to reports, the top of the tunnel reaches the equivalent of several stories in height. In fact, this network's so intricate that it was once believed that it must have been carved by human hand. It was long thought that the Zockling people, who were indigenous to Santa Catarina, were responsible for creating the tunnels. But over time, experts have come to realize that the formations date back much further. According to some estimates, they were created at least 12,000 years ago, though they could be far older than that. If humans didn't create the tunnels, though, then what did? If these holes were once the lairs of some ancient creatures, then the evidence suggests they must have been large ones. After all, the giant armadillo, the biggest burrowing animal in South America today, digs passageways that are just 16 inches across. So if a 90-pound animal living today digs a 16-inch by 20-foot burrow, what would dig one 5 feet wide and 250 feet long? Frank pondered. There's no explanation, not predators, not climate, not humidity. I really don't know. But while experts mightn't understand everything about the tunnels yet, they think that they might know what created them. Given the size of the burrows, the animal responsible for digging them must have been something pretty impressive. But in the 21st century, the largest mammal on the South American continent is the tapir, which weighs in at around 650 pounds. Yet back when the tunnels were made, there were far bigger creatures roaming the wilds of what today is Brazil. According to Frank, the larger tunnels were probably made by giant ground sloths, a type of megafauna that became extinct during the conclusion of the last ice age. Capable of growing to the size of a modern-day African elephant, these creatures sometimes reached as many as 20 feet in length and tipped the scales at almost 9,000 pounds. First emerging in South America more than 30 million years ago, the giant ground sloths eventually moved into North America as well. Typically, these herbivores inhabited forested areas where they enjoyed a diet of grasses and shrubs. And when supplies on the ground were scarce, the creatures could balance on their hind legs and retrieve food from high above. Initially, the giant ground sloths thrived across both continents. But then the Great Ice Age arrived, transforming vast swathes of the planet into frozen, inhospitable tundra. And like many creatures alive at the time, these great beasts struggled to survive in such difficult conditions. So when the planet warmed up again, they'd vanished from the Earth. While some academics claim that small populations of giant ground sloths outlived the Ice Age by several millennia, most agree that the creatures went extinct 12,000 or so years ago. And today, the animals are known only from their fossilized remains. But experts now believe that these huge, clawed mammals may have made their mark in a different way. According to Discover, Frank maintains that there are several subtypes of giant ground sloths that could have been responsible for carving the Peleabros of Brazil. But this isn't the only theory that's been put forward to explain the existence of the strange ancient tunnels that crisscross the Amazon region and beyond. Some, it seems, point to an extinct species of armadillo as the culprit behind the tunnels. Though larger than their modern equivalents, these creatures were still dwarfed by the giant ground sloths and would surely have struggled to dig such large holes. Still, it's been suggested that the animals may have worked together as a team to create the burrows. For Frank, documenting the Peleabros of Brazil has become something of an obsession. In fact, he's identified around 1,500 in Rio Grande do Sul alone. And when he isn't out in the field, Frank's scouring Google for photographs that might contain previously unnoticed examples of the phenomenon. I continue to get excited when I enter into a really well-preserved Peleabro with a lot of claw marks, Frank told the world. I get excited because it's the home of a prehistoric animal, and we are the first to go inside. And in an interview with Discover, he added, sometimes you get the feeling that there's some creature waiting around the next curve. Yet despite the proliferation of Peleabros in Brazil, these anomalies are largely absent from surrounding countries, though both giant ground sloths and armadillos thrived across the continent. According to Discover, the formations are most common in Rio Grande do Sul and Santa Catarina, in the south of the country. But just across the border in Uruguay, they're practically unheard of. Similarly, the phenomenon appears to be uncommon in the north of Brazil. So why are scientists mainly finding Peleabros in a specific geographic area? And why aren't there any in North America, where both creatures lived for thousands of years? According to paleontologist Greg MacDonald, an expert in giant ground sloths, there are a number of possible explanations. The fact that we don't have them here could simply be that we've overlooked them, MacDonald told Discover. Or it may be that we had them up here, but we didn't have the right types of soils that allowed them to survive for a long time. It could be, then, that an entire network of North American Peleabros is just waiting to be discovered. Something can be out there, and they're so common and people just take them for granted, MacDonald continued. And no one knows till somebody with a little bit of curiosity takes a closer look and says, what's forming these? Thanks to the work of people such as Frank, though, Peleabros are slowly moving into the spotlight at last. According to Discover, much of Frank's current research is focused around identifying patterns within these ancient structures. While some take the form of basic tunnels, you see, others are complex networks with multiple branches and entrances that encompass several rooms. And, perhaps most puzzlingly, the Peleabros discovered so far vary dramatically in size. We need to figure out the patterns, Frank explained. We're starting to understand this better. And from there, we'll be able to infer what kinds of different animals were digging them. But those hoping to study Peleabros will need to move fast. Because while urban development's often responsible for revealing the tunnels, it's also placing them in grave danger. In some places, for example, new developments have been erected directly on top of Peleabro sites. Elsewhere, modern graffiti has joined the ancient claw marks on the tunnel walls. Speaking to The World, Marcelo Crepaldi, who runs tours of one Santa Catarina location, said, "It's been really degraded since the first time I came here." Moving forwards, research into Peleabros is also likely to be hampered by decreases in the education budget in Brazil. But geologists such as Frank are determined to persevere. And as these tunnels continue to open up across the country, the researchers engage in a race against time to study them before they disappear. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to like and subscribe.